Hey Gurus, and welcome back to this demo lesson part 2, where we're going to get started picking back up off of where we left off from the last lesson. Alright Gurus, so we're back and our child policy has finished provisioning, so we'll go into this resource here, and under settings, what we'll see if we click on parent policy is we see the parent policy associated with this child policy here. We could choose to change this to another parent policy if we needed to, as long as it's inside of the same region as the child policy. And then we see we have our rule collections, and under our rule collections, we'll see both rule collections that exist for this policy, and in this case, we don't have any, and those that are inherited from the parent. Let's actually get into creating our own rule collection groups and rule collection for this child policy, and we'll focus around DNAT here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to click Add. We'll add a rule collection group, and we're going to call this our child DNAT RCG for rule collection group, and we're going to give it a priority of 300. We'll click Add here, and this is going to create that rule collection group for our child policy here, and this is what's going to be created that will be evaluated for our DNAT, and we'll create a rule collection and a rule inside of that group. So here we see our rule collection group for our child here, and we can choose to add a rule collection here and put it inside of that rule collection group. We'll call this our NAT collection. We're going to specify the rule collection type of DNAT. Then we're going to give it a priority of 300, and then rule collection group here. We'll put it in our child NAT rule collection group so that it's on the child policy and not the parent policy default DNAT rule collection group. And then we're going to give this a name here. We're going to be allowing SSH traffic into our VMs. And then here we see our source type. It could be an IP address or an IP group. If it were an IP group, we'd be able to select from the IP groups that we have here, and we created those resources. That's just something that makes creating rules a bit easier. I just wanted to show you that there, but we're going to use an IP address here, and we're going to have a source of a wildcard of any, so any traffic over a TCP protocol destined for port 22 is going to be heading to a translated address that is mapped to our public IP of our Azure Firewall, similar to as we've done in a previous demo. So let's go ahead and come up to our browser tab, right click, select duplicate, and then we're going to go to our Azure Firewall resource by clicking home, go into our resource group, and then we're going to find our firewall resource. We'll select it, we'll go to its public IP, we'll copy this public IP, and we're going to bring this back to our rule collection that we're creating here. We're going to paste this in as the destination, and then we're going to use a translated address that is equal to our private IP of the hub VM, and that's going to be 10.60.0.4, and then map that to port 22 on the translated port. Click Add, and this is going to add that NAT rule collection so that we can SSH into our virtual machine. So we'll be back once this rule collection has finished creating. Alright Gurus, we're back, and our NAT collection under our child NAT rule collection group has finished creating. If we click on it, we'll see the rule here that exists within it, allowing SSH. And all that's left to do now is make sure that we have this policy being applied to our firewall. So what we need to do is we'll come back to our other tab here, and we'll go back to our firewall resource. We'll visit Azure Firewall Manager to configure it here. And if we go under our virtual networks, what we'll see here is we have our hub VNet that is a secured virtual network because it has that firewall resource in it. And what we're going to do here is we're going to click on it, manage security, and we're going to choose another firewall policy, moving it away from this parent policy here to the child policy. We'll select our child policy here. We'll click review and confirm, and then it's going to validate the deployment of this. We'll click confirm, and it's going to switch over from the parent policy to the child policy. And then of course, that's going to inherit those rules from the parent policy itself. So we'll be back once this is done. All right, Gurus, so we're back. And if we go to our resource real fast, now what we'll see under Firewall Manager, if we head into Firewall Manager and then go back to Azure Firewall Manager's virtual networks, we'll see that our Cake Hub VNet is associated with the test parent firewall child policy. So that's the policy that's being used with our firewall in the hub VNet. And of course, we also see that the spoke VNet is peered to a virtual hub here that has an Azure Firewall resource. Now, the only thing left to do is to test the rules that we have, the NAT rule that's on the child policy, and the net rule and application rule that are on the parent policy that are being inherited by this child policy. So we'll open up our Cloud Shell here, and what we're going to do is use that public IP address that we got from our firewall itself and try to make an SSH connection. We'll clear up our display here, type SSH, type in our username, paste in the public IP, and it's going to connect. We'll accept the fingerprint. We'll put in our password here, and we're inside of our VM, and this is our hub VM 01. We'll clear up our display, and that's validated our allow SSH NAT rule in the child policy. Now we have those two parent rules, both for net and application. So to validate the net, we're going to do the DNS lookup. We'll do dig type txt. We're going to do test.dns.google.com single quote at dns.google in single quote, hit enter, and this is going to tell us right here that we queried using the custom DNS servers that are set up 8.8.8.8. So that validates our network rule. We'll clear up our display here again. We'll type curl http://microsoft.com. We see we have an action of deny because there is no rule match. We'll tab back up here. We'll type in the same thing except www. And now we see we get the return traffic because we do have a rule for www.microsoft.com. So we've successfully implemented Azure Firewall policy, and we've played around with parent and child policies. That concludes this demo. Let's make our way back to the slides for a quick review. All right, Gurus, welcome back to the slides. And if you completed following along in this demo lesson, congratulations on implementing Azure Firewall policies. Now, the key takeaways from this lesson for our Azure Firewall policy-based rules, as we saw, is we can migrate from classically implemented rules on firewalls to policy-based rules. And obviously, we can just create Azure Firewalls that are policy-based rules to begin with. Now, as we saw, because our firewall was a premium tier, it did support this migration to policy-based rules. Again, because policy-based rules are only supported by premium tier Azure Firewall resources. And whenever we have policy-based Azure Firewall management type, this firewall becomes managed by an Azure Firewall Manager resource as our central place for managing policies, securing virtual networks with those firewalls. And we also have that policy resource. As we saw, we have the parent and the child resource policies that we created, and we use those to associate with our secure virtual network that had our firewall in it. And again, that firewall resource itself is what makes that virtual network a secure virtual network, because a firewall exists inside of that virtual network. And the next key takeaway was the policy hierarchy and objects that were involved. Again, we had that parent policy that was then passing rules down to the child policy, so it was inheriting those rules. And then we also saw that the objects inside of our policies were actually, right, under the policy, we had a rule collection group. Then we had a rule collection of a rule type, DNAT network or application rules. And then we had the rules that exist inside of that rule collection. We could have multiple rules inside of there, and we can almost call those rule sets, really. And then we had an order of operations for our firewall rules. And this is the same between policy-based or classically implemented rule management firewalls. It goes DNAT rules, network rules, and application rules. And of course, the priorities on the actual rule collection groups and rule collections does play into that, as well as parent to child policy inheritance, but always first DNAT, network, and then application rules. All right, Gurus, thanks so much for joining me in this lesson where we implemented Azure Firewall policies. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.